Comrades, today let us talk about Europe. It has been a while since we last discussed Europe, so it is a good time to do so. Last time, we talked about the Dunce King threatening the EU to make concessions quickly. Otherwise, on August 1st, a trade war would start, imposing a 30% tariff on EU goods. The EU naturally worries about the US increasing tariffs, and they are eager to resolve the agreement issue quickly, but they also know that things can't be rushed, because there's an old Chinese saying, think thrice before you act. In European terms, it would be said as to, free, go. You have to take it step by step. So in this process, they engaged in multiple rounds of negotiation. On July 15th, 2025, the EU and the US. A new round of trade negotiations has begun. The EU has sent its trade commissioner, a Slovak from the former Austro-Hungarian Empire, Maros Sefcovic. On the American side, they have sent the former CEO of Genta, current U.S. Secretary of Commerce, Howard Lutnick, responsible for the coordination and the negotiations. The American side is adamant that we have suffered too many losses in the past. The EU has taken too much advantage of the U.S. Now it is your turn to pay it back. Now the EU representatives can't take it anymore. How many deals have you closed with me? You have not even closed $1 trillion. Why should I listen to you? This 20% tariff is too excessive. We can't accept it. At most 10%. Then I won't care. As the saying goes, it is only right to repay debts. I borrowed 200 from you, and you only gave me 100. That means you owe me 100. Hurry up and pay me back. If we can't reach an agreement by August 1st, then just wait for the 30% tariff hammer from the US. In the end, the harmonious negotiations still did not succeed. To counter possible US tariffs, the EU also made some preparations. For example, they prepared retaliatory measures worth 72 billion euros, including tariffs on American aircraft and automobiles, and other potential items, such as export restrictions on certain steel and chemical products, and regarding the service industry in the United States, especially for tech companies with large trade surpluses with the EU and the financial sector. Necessary actions will be taken. In short, the EU is fully prepared. If negotiations with the US on August 1st do not go well, then a fierce trade war will ensue. You won't make things easy for us. Then let us go all out and stir-fry the fish with chili. Let us give it our all. Looks like the tariffs issue still is not settled. Now even von der Leyen can't sit still. Damn it. Vichy is incompetent. It seems I have to step in. On July 25th, von der Leyen personally called Trump. About the tariffs, both sides are exchanging words, engaging in a heated debate. They finally agreed to discuss this in Scotland on July 27th, mostly because President Trump wants to go there to play golf. Meeting von der Leyen is just a side note. Mama von der Leyen was pretty tough on the phone. When she sees President Trump, she will be different. As the saying goes, no one will support my ambition to reach the clouds. I can't get there on my own. Let us leave it at that. After nearly 4 months of uncertainty, the US and EU trade agreement finally took shape on July 27th. It now has a general direction and framework. The United States will impose a 15% tariff on about 70% of EU exports on goods exported to the EU. This includes automotive computer chips and pharmaceuticals. As for the steel, aluminum, and copper industries, they remain unchanged. It is still a 50% tariff. Under reciprocal tariffs, the EU retaliates with 0 tariffs on the US. However, the EU might be thinking, according to Newton's third law, for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. If you hit me, I hit you back. If you raise my taxes, I will raise yours. So we are even. According to some details in the agreement, the EU needs to make concessions to the US. This includes simplifying health permit requirements for American pork and dairy products, eliminating non-tariff barriers to trade in American agricultural products. In addition, the EU will also purchase $750 billion in US energy and $600 billion in new investments in the US, such as purchasing more American military equipment, like missiles, fighter jets, defense systems, and so on. Maybe Trump is afraid that countries are increasing military spending just like NATO, and he is delaying the matter until 2035. So everything he demanded from the EU must be completed by 2028. It is worth noting that, according to Voice of America, the United States imposes a 15% tariff on the EU, and the EU has to pay for it themselves. You might be curious, isn't the tariff usually paid by the buyer? Why is the EU paying taxes to the United States? Because Trump demands that EU goods lower their prices. I already mentioned this in my previous updates. What does Trump's so-called tariff increase mean? Either Europeans think American tariffs are too high. Stop selling things to the US. This move helps me, the US, to reindustrialize, self-production, and self-sales. Americans will buy American-made products. Either the EU lowers the prices of goods exported to the US, by reducing the profit margins on those goods to maintain export volumes to the U.S. while further narrowing the trade surplus with the U.S. instead of making U.S. importers bear the tariffs and then passing the costs onto the American public. In short, Trump is not planning to take any losses. When going to the hospital for surgery, the doctor said the success rate is only 20%. Even the wise one has to say, then I will have 5 surgeries. Of course, the EU is willing to bear the tariff costs. This is a report from Voice of America. I do not even know where they heard this news. Maybe they set up the radio station in Brussels again. In a post-incident interview, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen also told reporters that the new tariff rates represent a good agreement. This will restore stability and predictability to transatlantic trade. A reporter also tentatively asked him, "Don't you think 15% is too much? Isn't the EU's contribution disproportionate to the returns?" But the reporter asked this. It is obviously leading. He is setting a trap. If von der Leyen says in front of the wise king that Europe has suffered greatly, that America has tricked us, it would make it seem like someone is pressuring him. How can the wise king back down from that? You can't let Diane Wei say that. The cause of death is Wei Wu's whip. Moreover, the EU is voluntary. Aunt Fong warned the reporters, saying that although 15% is not insignificant, this is already the best result we can achieve. We are grateful. President Trump's kindness can never be repaid. So how does the EU view this matter internally? First, there is the EU giant, Germany. It is a mixed bag for them, both happy and disappointed. Happy, because at least they pushed for the agreement. They avoided a trade war with the U.S. As we all know, before 1945, the 3 engines driving the German economy were Kaiser Wilhelm, Guderian, and Manstein. Thus, it was consumption that drove the German economy after the Cold War. Investment in exports, especially exports to the United States, were the main part. Now, the tariff issues have been mostly discussed. There is no need to engage in a tariff war with the United States. MERS is naturally happy about this. But the problem is, a 15% tariff is way too high. I think 10% could be managed. Germany is very eager to negotiate further, to obtain additional exemptions. Meanwhile, France's far left, far right, and centrist 3-party coalition are all very dissatisfied with this agreement. French Prime Minister Berulle said, "This agreement marks France's darkest day. Léo Delalue, you traitor. Look at the mess you have made." French entrepreneur Arnold Bertrand even referred to this agreement as a one-way transfer of wealth. It does not seem like an equal agreement. It resembles more of a 19th century colonial power, those unequal treaties imposed on the weak. But this time, Europe is the one receiving. You lovely Americans, how can you be so mean? This is imperialism, colonialism. How can you bully the weak? Where is the principle? Where is the sovereignty? And all along, Hungary's Prime Minister Orbán, who has always disapproved, is even angrier. He expressed his anger during a live broadcast. "I thought this old woman, von der Leyen, went to negotiate to play pig to eat tiger. I thought you were pretending to be a pig to eat the tiger. I was still thinking you might be able to curb America's arrogance and help Europe gain some benefits. But in the end, Trump just gobbled him up like breakfast, not a bone left behind." We used to look down on the British, saying they bowed to America and signed treacherous agreements. But the agreement we made is way more embarrassing than what Britain did. At least in Britain, they only face a 10% tariff, while we have to pay 15%. As the saying goes, when some people worry, others rejoice. After hearing this news, the British people were overjoyed. Boris Johnson's former assistant, who was also a main architect of Brexit, Dominic Cummings, this guy has completely let go. It has been 5 years since Brexit in 2020. 5 years. Because of the decline of the British economy after Brexit, I was called an idiot, a waste, a fool, a clown. Now I can finally clear my name. Look at the EU's current situation. Cummings celebrated on Twitter. "Thank you, Brexit. We avoided a disaster for the European Union, a shameful catastrophe." This guy, at the beginning of the post, even used 2 clown emojis. It is like killing someone, and also attacking their heart. And earlier, he strongly opposed Brexit, saying Brexit would harm the UK Prime Minister, Stamer. They actually proposed a new concept. The Brexit dividend refers to the UK operating freely outside the EU trade framework. The freedom to act independently. This was a major advantage in negotiations with Trump. It has been 5 years since Brexit was finalized. Today, UTURE. Finally, they see the money coming back. Even if the compensation is small, it is still called making a profit. Comrades, remember this day. This is the moment the UK can be most proud of. The key point is, for something so worthy of pride, I wonder if Starmer will meet with His Majesty the King. Maybe Charles will host a few tables in Reykjavik. And what the New York Times revealed, as the effective date of Trump's 30% tariffs approaches, August 1st is getting closer. European bureaucrats are worried that if a full-scale trade war breaks out, the retaliation from the United States could be painful. This is because Trump has said that as long as trade partners impose retaliatory tariffs on him, he will respond with even higher ones. If the tariffs are too high, businesses won't be able to bear it. We Europeans still need to do business with the Americans. Not to mention the response from the understanding king. It could involve multiple aspects. For example, in military matters, what if he suddenly says he wants to withdraw from NATO? Or let Russia join the G7. What would we do if it became the G8? And according to Sefcovic's disclosure, the EU can't let the US off the hook completely. You have to contribute something, right? So the US-EU agreement also involves many hidden details. For example, implementing zero tariffs on strategic goods. This includes aircraft and aircraft parts, certain chemicals, semiconductor equipment, some agricultural products and goods, some natural resources, and key raw materials. This is relatively beneficial for the EU. But the specific details are still unclear. It is not just about trade. The agreement also includes security and military, geopolitics, Russia, Ukraine, and most importantly, ideological issues are also taken into account. Imagine that if Europe and the United States went to war over tariffs, both would suffer. Who would be the happiest then? Hey, India, so for the greater good and for the sake of ideology, Europe only made a small concession. This might be why, after the EU compromised, Trump began to pressure Putin. He demanded that Putin end the war within 10 days. The EU is funding it. You also need to do your part. But we all know what kind of person Trump is. Every move he makes, it all depends on the last person who communicates with him. When the US-Ukraine mineral agreement was signed, Dongzi was pressuring Putin and also sending F-16 parts to Koizumi. As a result, Koizumi was full of confidence for only a few days. Then he went back to having long phone calls with Putin. So Dongzi is someone you really can't trust, especially when it comes to integrity. Among that group of despicable merchants, Trump is at the top of the despicable list. He is a bastard like Soros. The worst of the worst. They all think they are much more honest than Trump. It is easy to imagine just how low Trump's honesty has sunk, and we also need to know that the current US-EU agreement is for reference only. Please refer to the actual content. Why is that? One aspect is that Trump is very unreliable. For example, he had previously made arrangements with Japan. Then he wanted to change everything. So the EU must be prepared for potential changes. On the other hand, the agreement is not something Liu Delailu said was agreed upon. So how many times has she been through this? If we want to add a legal buff to this agreement, it must be approved by all EU member states. And it needs to be reviewed by the European Parliament. It has to pass both sides for it to be fine. I estimate it will take a while to go back and forth. Moreover, Liu Delailu is not reliable in handling matters. Negotiations have not been clarified. The level of detail is not aligned. For example, on the most important pharmaceutical issues, Trump said the agreement did not cover medicines, which means 15%. That is just a token gesture. You get what I mean, right? If the EU exports more medicines, don't blame me for not being sincere. Taxes still need to be increased. But Liu Delailu stated that pharmaceuticals are already included. The maximum tax is only 15%. The two of them talked for a long time, but their granularity did not align. If this kind of ridiculous agreement passes, then the EU is indeed in trouble. Of course, there is no shame in backing down to Trump. What kind of man is Trump anyway? I used to have a misconception about him, thinking he only dared to bully the weak, but I did not expect that when he gets ruthless, he does not even spare himself. Recently, in front of the media, the wise king openly said that his wife Melania likes Putin. It is no wonder that self-disciplined men are the most terrifying. He is so disciplined. Who can provoke him? Here, I need to tell everyone something. It is about the tariffs between the EU and the US. Regarding the agreement they need to sign, the reason I have not updated at first was not laziness. It is because I was waiting because of the current agreement. Antfung has only reached a framework agreement with the United States. The specific details still need to be discussed within the EU. It is a situation with no clear conclusion. In this state, I can't fully explain it to everyone. Everyone is also confused about what is going on. And I am quite curious too. What was agreed upon on July 27th is set to be implemented on August 1st. But how can a document without legal effect be enforced? Just like the EU's indecisiveness, they definitely won't reach a consensus in 3 days. So I want to see how this agreement gets stuck. What will happen next? Will the EU reluctantly accept this? Or will the US just push forward without caring, forcing their way through? I am set on this agreement, and I want to go with a 15% cut. Or maybe just delay it a bit. Take a step back and wait for the EU to sort things out first. Then, on August 1st, Trump actually made a concession. He signed a new order. It postponed the effective date for the 15% tariffs on European goods, postponed to August 7th, giving the EU another week to negotiate, so they can hurry up and discuss. The key is that this old guy Trump truly lives up to his background as a businessman. He even has some limited time discount policies. He told the EU to ship before August 7th. Goods delivered to the United States before October 5th will be exempt from new tariffs. In other words, you all need to discuss this quickly. Come to an agreement and sign it right away. There is a limited time tax exemption now. Once this opportunity passes, it won't come again. So how is the EU discussing this matter? First of all, we definitely cannot accept von der Leyen's framework. That is just ridiculous. Are you treating us like fools? The key point is that the Japanese did not sign such a humiliating treaty either. They only have a 15% tariff. And it is reciprocal. You ended up with a 15-0 deal. Damn, that is so embarrassing. Even the usually reticent French President Macron expressed in a cabinet meeting, I tell you, this matter with the Americans is not over. The guys are not done with you. This is not the end of the story. We will not back down. To gain freedom, you must instill fear, but Europe has not fully realized that it is a major power. We are not feared enough. I urge Europe to take a tougher stance towards the United States. Don't lose your spirit. The Netherlands is also unhappy. Because the Netherlands has a trade deficit with the US, it is not making any profit itself. Now we still have to suffer along with the EU. So all my efforts were for nothing. Not only do we not get a share, but we also have to put in more money. Right? Deputy Minister of Trade for the Netherlands, Hanneke Borma, stated, the agreement is not ideal. It could have a significant impact on Dutch and European businesses. We do not accept and urge the European Commission to continue negotiations with the United States regarding tariff reductions and improving economic cooperation. Portugal is equally unhappy because the U.S. is Portugal's fourth largest buyer and the largest outside the European Union, accounting for 6.7% of Portugal's total exports. These 15% tariffs now will definitely affect Portugal's trade with the U.S. Portuguese Prime Minister Costa also said, although the agreement brings predictability and stability, a single agreement impacts bilateral trade. The EU imposes low and submissive tariffs of 50-60%. It affects the development of 7, 8, or 9 countries, and 10 are suffering. I am a small country. Portugal. I still hope to get some trade exemptions. Let us talk more, but their bargaining attitude really annoys Italy. We are all the 5 pigs of Europe. Why is your pig from Portugal even dumber than mine? What if you guys push us too hard? What if the US imposes a 30% tariff on us? Just accept the 15%. In trade with the US, 9 out of 10 are favorable. Earn an extra $876 million. Europe's 5 pigs, 4 wastes, and 3 fools still want exemptions for 2 countries. This is a first-class scoundrel. As long as there is money to be made, that is all that matters. Stop thinking about all that nonsense. Hurry up and sign with the US already. And Italian Foreign Minister Antonio Tajani also emphasized that, according to estimates by the Italian government's trade agency, implementing a 15% tax rate is expected to cause Italy a short-term loss of at least between 14 billion and 15 billion euros annually. In principle, this amount is roughly equivalent to the cost of building the Messina Strait Bridge. But the problem is, Minister, we spent money on the Messina Strait Bridge, but it has not been built. I know, that is why I described it this way. We have spent money and seen nothing in return. In fact, getting EU countries to accept a 15% tariff will also put a lot of psychological pressure on them, mainly because they had too high an opinion of themselves before. The words are set in stone. In May, the G7 countries were discussing matters in Canada. Meanwhile, the UK and the US were negotiating a trade agreement. In the end, they agreed to a 10% tariff from the US. As a result, the EU was the first to stand up and oppose it. They stated that it was too humiliating. The EU firmly refused to accept such humiliating terms. As a result, the US has come up with an even more humiliating thing to accept. Of course, you would be hesitant to accept that. I would not even want to show my face, no matter what. The US should at least pay more. So currently, what are the main demands from the EU toward the US? First, a 15% tariff. The EU intends to grit its teeth and accept it. But a 50% tariff on steel and aluminum is indeed a bit too high. 15% is too low. So the EU is thinking, why not just go for a tax exemption? Strive for some duty-free quotas. For any amount exceeding the quota, an additional 50% tariff will be charged. And then there are digital and agricultural barriers. The EU is willing to simplify health permits and cover the costs, but it can't be done at this stage. After all, this set of regulations has been in place for so many years, you can't just scrap it. It would definitely lose the trust of those citizens who support us. Their trust in us So the EU currently wants to retain the right to self-regulate. And also regarding pharmaceuticals, medicines are a major export for the EU, especially for Ireland. So the EU is willing to not demand a duty-free quota, but the tax rate is capped at 15%. It absolutely cannot be increased. Because of this, Ireland and Northern Ireland have already had conflicts. Why is that? Because Northern Ireland belongs to the UK. I should only pay 10% in tariffs. But the problem is they have not left the EU. Following the EU means paying 15%. But Northern Ireland does not accept that. They believe that when I am in the UK, I am British. When I am in the EU, I am European. Now I feel like I am British. So I should only pay 10% tax. The United States also agrees on this point. But the key issue is Ireland and Northern Ireland, they have a high degree of overlap in dairy processing, and the service industry. You impose a 10% tax on them, and you do not allow Irish products to be labeled in Northern Ireland. It is like a pair of twins. You buy them a red toy. Is this going to cost me my life? So the medical sector is 15%. Just stick with that. Do not increase it. And then there is what everyone is more concerned about. Before Trump's second term ends, the EU plans to purchase $750 billion worth of American energy and invest $600 billion in the US. First of all, this EU statement sounds more like a promise of assurance. The EU guarantees to buy American goods for you, but it may not necessarily meet the set standards. At most, it is only half. For example, in terms of energy, the EU currently buys less than $100 billion from the US each year. Even if you work them to death for 3 years, it won't reach $750 billion. So the EU can only ensure a reduction of reliance on Russia for energy. Buy more American energy. But their commitment is enough for me. The main thing is to let Europe and Russia clash completely. That way, the United States can continue selling energy to Europe. And then there is the matter of investing $600 billion. This is handled by EU companies. The European Commission cannot force private companies to invest in the US. So technically speaking, there is no guarantee that these amounts can be reached. But we will definitely strive to meet the standards as much as possible. Additionally, we will seek some quotas in beverages and in agricultural products as well. Honestly, I feel that this time the EU has really given in. Even if the US agrees to all of the EU's demands, the EU will still suffer significant losses. Signing an agreement with the US in the short term can indeed help the EU avoid some uncertainties and the trade war, but in the long run, the EU's weak and ineffective mindset and performance will also weaken their bargaining chips in future negotiations. You need to stand up for yourself. Such a lack of effective defense of one's own interests will only make the EU suffer more in future negotiations and concede more benefits. Other countries looking to cooperate with the EU will also weigh their options. Can the EU really be relied upon? This further undermines Europe's self-esteem as a geopolitical core. The master manipulator. Don't say you are the world's third tier anymore. It is truly embarrassing. But for now, the EU has not yet decided to sign. Countries are still discussing, trying to kneel with one foot or half a leg in front of the United States. We need to understand the cost of this. And did not France say they wanted to take a tougher stance? What is the point of confronting the US if in the end, little brother Ma really brings out the EU godfather? The spirit of de Gaulle, the cute one, won't sign anymore. The tariff war with the Americans has begun. If that is the case, the EU will really be impressive. Anyway, before the final signing, anything is possible. We will have to see whether the EU will fight or negotiate. We still need to watch for further developments. Alright, that is it for this video. If you like it, please help by liking and following. See you next time. Maybe one day I will surprise you unexpectedly.